Good morning. This is Jason Dean. Good morning, YouTubers. This is a early early edition. It's funny. I don't usually get up this early for to do these shows, but I it's kind of unusual. Like I saw this movie last night for the first time, and I've been thinking about it since I went to bed. I tried, and I finished it relatively early, and then I put it in another movie because I've been talking about how the last few weeks or so, if you can see my cup, it's backwards, but I've been going. I went about 3 times or so to my favorite place, Bull Moose Music, and that's where I buy all my films and stuff. And I had finished this movie that this show is about. And I'm gonna talk about, and I tried to, and then I finished it relatively on the early side, and I put in another movie, and it was kind of getting late. I was kind of tired, but I couldn't get the movie that I had just seen out of my head. I just kept thinking about it, and I just got so distracted that finally I couldn't concentrate on anything that I was watching on after this movie. So I finally just called it a night and went to bed. But I ended up getting up too early. Sometimes I get up. I mean, compared to a few years ago, I uh, I get up on the earlier side of things. But I kind of feel in some ways it's better. I don't know, I get a little bit more work done, and I'm a little bit more focused. Being a musician or artist, or whatever. Like I typically, in the past, I would typically go to bed on the later side. I'd stay up pretty late. One of the things that I had happen to me uh, when I first started recording music and when I first started writing music. Not so much outside of that. Sometimes it's a I guess it's a trait or a stereotype thing that happens for musicians, but sometimes after gigs, there's certain kinds of things. There's it's hard to kind of unwind after a show or after a gig. You're kind of particularly if it was a fun event. And even if it wasn't a great event, even if like you felt like you were not on your game, or you were struggling through moments of it or whatnot, typically it's talked about with musicians. It's hard to kind of like decompress after gigs and basically get to bed at a reasonable hour. Another stereotype of musicians is that we all stay up really late. We're night people, and we stay up to till the sun comes up, and we kind of live this uh, lifestyle that's similar to like how a vampire would live. And when I was younger, I would like I'm still definitely a night person overall, but it's interesting because I never really had that happen to me as far as like sleeping issues around music related things until I started recording music. I remember when I first started, way back when I first attempted to write music on my own, and then it got to the point where I started recording stuff. I had these really intense bouts of insomnia. And what would happen was, whether it was always centered around recording music. When I would be in the studio space and I'd be writing music. The first album I did, my the first experience I had writing music was many many years ago, and I wrote this album for this like one-off project that was called Club Unknown, and it was basically it was this big giant experimentation to see how I could do this, if I could do it, what it would be like. and all these kinds of things. Up until that point, I basically, I was playing drums and you know, a few different bands, and being essentially a side man. I didn't really have any creative input per se. I basically would play for for the band or for what the artist wanted. During that time when I first recorded the album, I was playing a lot with this band called Tree by Leaf, and that was a folk rock kind of bass thing. And then I had, maybe four or five other projects I was playing with, and and basically I was like a hired, more or less a hired person, and I was friends with with most of the folks I was working with, and we would kind of hang out socially. But for the most part, I was kind of hired to, to provide. Uh, my job was to basically show up and play drums and try to, you know, uh, fill up that spot and create and to, make this music hopefully as strong as I could. But I didn't outside of that, I didn't really have any creative output. I never contributed to the songwriting or to the arrangements. So, and in some regards too, there were a lot of situations where I, had drum parts kind of written for me, or the singers or the songwriters for those particular projects would, kind of leave it up to me as to what I would play. But most of the time, were wanting something very specific, so I would, rehearse with them, and didn't really do. At that point, I didn't do any recording. I did when I first got out of Berkeley. I was fortunate enough to do a lot of recording. One of the coolest experiences I had around that, and at that time too, when I did recording, I didn't really like it. I was more fascinated and interested in trying to become a better live musician, like playing gigs, and that was the area that I really loved. And it's still, overall my favorite thing to do as far as music goes. Playing gigs, like whatever capacity that is, like to me, that's still the the most challenging, and also I get the most enjoyment out of that. But I remember when I finished up at Berkeley College of Music, I was living in Boston, and my folks had moved up here to Maine. And this was like when I graduated high school was like 1995, 94, 95. So my folks had moved to Maine. I grew up in New York, and my folks had moved up to Maine. When I was a kid, earlier, my folks used to have a summer camp up in Island Falls, New York. I mean, Island Falls, Maine, which was up past Holton, Maine, way up north, like about 5 hours or so from where I live now here in Northport. And my folks used to have a camp up there on the water at this little lake that was there, and it was really cool. It was a beautiful spot. And so, like during our summers, when I was in middle school and high school, we would come up to Maine during the summer. And my folks totally fell in love with Maine. And I remember going, spending my summers up, when school would get out during summer vacation. We would go up for like 3 or 4 weeks, and it was great. It was beautiful. It was like we had this cool little cabin. My dad and my mom had built it, and I had helped out too. And we had a little, we had a nice little area where, I used to do a lot of fishing when I was a kid. So we, go out fishing, and it was in this totally remote area, but we'd go swimming, and, I would take the boat out a lot. We had this little motor boat, and it was really cool. I remember bringing, I back then I had a Walkman, and I remember bringing cassettes and putting cassettes in my little Walkman and putting my headphones on and just driving around the lake for hours and do a little bit of fishing and swimming and there was a game room and a like a little restaurant that was part of where we lived or in the area. And we'd go there, and it was like there was a camp, like a summer camp thing, so that you get tourists in there. But a totally remote area and very very quiet. But it was super cool. It was a really, fun, enjoyable part of my childhood. And like I don't know, 5 years or so into it, once when I was in high school, my folks grew up. They're both New Yorkers, and they grew up. My mom grew up in New York City, and my dad grew up in Long Island. And both sides of our family still live there in those areas, and they were really tired of living in New York and living in an area where it was really congested and getting more and more built up, and they fell in love with Maine. So their plan was that once I graduated high school, they were going to move to Maine and basically, find a place, build a house, and kind of retire and live their lives there. So that's what they did. They moved when I graduated high school, and at that time I had gotten accepted to school, and I moved to Boston to go to Berkeley. So for a while I was going back and forth, you know, uh, mostly on breaks after they moved up here. During vacation or breaks, I would come up to Maine and stay at my folks' place, and and it was great. I really loved it. I didn't know anybody here. All my friends were still in New York, but I would go to these jazz. There were a series of these different jams that were going on in Belfast and a couple other places, and I was in my early 20s. I think I'd even just turned 21, so I was going. I didn't know anybody, but I was slowly meeting a few musicians and friends that to this day I still play with. And but I was going through this transitional period where I wasn't sure where I wanted to live and so forth. So I went back and forth for a while, and then I finished school. I knew I wanted to try to attempt to be a musician in some capacity. So I went. I almost stayed in Boston. I had met this guy who was this guitar player. His name was Cliff, and he was a really great musician, super cool guy. He wanted to start a band and basically do the whole traditional thing where I we would like start a band and have our base have the band based in Boston and just try to make it happen somehow. But I was so green and inexperienced, and I didn't know anything about how to go about doing it and how to work in a city and just all this stuff. It was kind of overwhelming at that point. But I wanted to do it, but I wasn't sure how to do it, and I kept going back and forth between where I wanted to live, and eventually came to Maine, and I met some people and met some great musicians, Glenn Dubois, Mike Whitehead, lots of great musicians, and we started becoming friends, and I started playing some gigs with those guys over a period of a couple of years. One of the coolest events or coolest things that I had no experience really being in a recording studio, and my friend Glenn Dubois had a pretty extensive career in like recording in the recording industry and being a professional musician and the whole 9 yards. Just an amazing guy all around, and just so much experience. But he had a studio, and he was recording all the time in this area called the East Base in Rockland, Maine. And he had a partner at the time and his name was Buddy Revell, and they used to do all these recording sessions together, and I somehow met him through Glenn, and and for whatever reason, Glenn had mentioned my name to him, and we had met, and Buddy had heard me play or something, and he had asked me if I was like really interested in doing, you know, a bunch of recording sessions because they had a real active studio back then. They were making their living. They were working with lots of different bands and singers and artists that were in Maine, but they were also working with a lot of bands and artists that were out of state. Like people from all around the country were coming through this studio to record, and they were making their living doing this. And he had asked me, both of them had asked me if I was like interested in, you know, in doing these recording or like these session gigs. And I had no experience and I had no idea what I was doing. I was just trying to figure out something that I could do to keep music going and try to develop and to try to like gain more and more experience. So, and I had zero experience at that time recording. So I said yes. And I started recording, and it was probably, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 months after I started recording with them, or it was probably about 6 months to a year after I finished Berkeley. I started going to that studio, and it was in Rockland, Maine. It was this beautiful space, big recording studio, and I started recording there. Like, I guess it was like maybe I was there for a couple of years, and like every month or so, I would go in, sometimes a few times a month, and do these various recording sessions. Sometimes it would be, like folk based stuff, and sometimes there would be, it was all over the place. A lot of this stuff was rock. There would be even these like kind of 80s hair metal bands that would come through there. Like there, I remember there was one band in particular that was kind of like the Spinal Tap thing, and it was really funny and hilarious. But during that time, I had all of these recording sessions, and I was getting paid to do it, and it was really great experience. I didn't really like the work because it was so hard. I felt like I was under a microscope. I was really insecure about it. But I just decided, well, I'm going to do this because this is like, I'm gaining something new. I'm going to learn a lot. So I just threw myself into it, and I started doing all these recording sessions, and I got to know them and stuff. And the cool thing was is that Buddy Revell, who was Glenn's partner, was a really, really experienced recording engineer. And over time, I got to know him. And he was a pretty famous, when he was younger, he was a pretty famous producer. He had recorded a bunch of albums for Eric Clapton. He had recorded a bunch of albums for Cream, Eric Clapton's band, a whole bunch of other artists during the 60s and 70s. And so I looked at it as just a real cool, tremendous experience because I was like, 2021 with, you know, with the only experience I had was I just finished up music school, but I played in lots of rock bands and metal bands, but I had no experience outside of that. So it was a great learning experience, and but I didn't, the process itself, and especially I wanted to do it anyway, and I kind of made myself do it, and it was mainly because of the experience that these guys had had, especially Buddy Revell. So I was like, this will be a great thing to learn. So I did, and then eventually from there I started playing gigs and slowly developed these different relationships with people and that kind of thing. And years after that, or quite a few years later, I had this idea of like trying to record music and maybe write some music that I had. My mom had gotten me a keyboard for Christmas, and I had like a this cheap guitar. I'd always been a little bit of a guitar player back then, so I started having these ideas of music that I was into. I was getting into lots of different kinds of music at the time. I was getting into a lot of fusion music, like one of my favorite bands uh, from the 60s and 70s, or 70s is Mahavishnu Orchestra. Still one of my all-time favorite fusion bands, just amazing, with Billy Cobham and John McLaughlin. I was just listening. I have their CD that I'm listening to in my car, Birds of Fire. One of the most amazing bands, and I was listening to a lot of James Brown. I was also listening to a lot of electronic music, like groups like Aphex Twin and Square Pusher. I was listening to a lot of reggae at the time. I was into a lot of groups like Augustus Pablo, who's one of my favorite probably my favorite reggae artist, and that's more where he's more known as like a he plays more of a style that's called dub reggae, which is predominantly more instrumental. It tends to be a little bit on the darker side. I was really into like Massive Attack, so I was listening to a lot of different things, and I was really getting into the Mahavishnu stuff, and I was starting to experiment with trying to practice and learn songs or tunes that were in odd meters, meaning like anything that's not in 4/4. So I was like trying to mess around with that stuff. I was also taking lessons from Jeff Densmore, who is to this day a really great friend, a really great mentor. So I was like, trying to further my education in music, obviously, because you never stop learning. And I was also like checking out and into a lot of very variations of different styles. So it was a really cool time. So I come up with these ideas of writing material. And I remember when I got into the studio and I recorded the music, I started having these really bad bouts of insomnia. I couldn't really unwind, and I started thinking about this or that, or like, okay, I need to do this the next day. And I was piecemealing that band because I was getting different musicians that I had worked with to come in and record. And it was a lot of scheduling it was kind of a nightmare, and I can't really read music, so I was trying to express what I wanted through these to these musicians in a way that was not easy. So, and I was working with a good friend, my friend Jeff Weinberger, who's a really great musician. He really helped a lot. He had a recording studio, so we would work on these things together, and I'd articulate it or play them, and then he was able to break it down to a point of where we could like chart the tunes, and then we'd bring in different musicians. And I had, and it was about the album had about 7 or 8 songs on it, and on almost every song I had a different batch of musicians, and it was called Club Unknown. That was the name of the project. It had a little, it had a lot of variety. There was funk stuff, there was more fusion kind of bass stuff. Had some tunes that were in odd meters, and then I had some like heavy electronic stuff, some reggae stuff. Like it was a just a reflection of all the stuff I was into, and I still am very much that's those styles. But so it was a great learning experience, but it was so hard. It was so tough, and I enjoyed it, but then I didn't because it was kind of a nightmare as far as like the scheduling goes. One of the coolest things about that though was the experience of it and gaining the knowledge of how to work with different groups of people, but then also just gaining experience of what it's like to be a writer. One of the cool things too, I was able to get, like I said, a lot of varied players from different backgrounds and musicians that I met over that time, and they were all like gracious enough to come in and record. But one of the coolest things is I had this guy Hal Hagee, who's this really great sax player in the area, who kind of lost touch with him a little bit, but I used to play gigs with him. Really cool guy, amazing sax player, and he actually played on quite a bit of the album, and which was pretty awesome. But his background was pretty amazing. He during the '60s and '70s had played with a real famous band called Little Feat, so he had all of this knowledge. He'd recorded a couple of their, I believe, on 1 or 2 of their albums. He played saxophone on some of their albums, on some of their tunes, and so he had this really great experience and tremendous amount of experience with his background. So it was really cool. Like I'm a firm believer that like, if you meet musicians and you get a chance to play with them, especially if they're better and more experienced than you should dive into it because you really gain a lots of knowledge. And then since then, I had recorded a bunch of music and tried, you know, developing it, but I wasn't really into that space. I wasn't really enjoying it. I knew I wanted to do it, but it was so hard. One of the coolest experiences related around the Club Unknown thing when we did that was I remember like it was a one-off thing. We had one performance. We played at the Three Tides. We put together this band, and we played the whole album, and it was great. We sold a lot of albums, but it was, in some ways it was a disaster because I had, I don't know, 500 CDs made, and it cost me a lot of money to make. I didn't really know how to do it, and I ended up sitting on all these CDs that were not going anywhere. But initially, we sold a lot. I remember going at one point going to this party, and it was such a cool, kind of trippy experience. But I remember one time I went to this party with a bunch of folks I kind of didn't really know. One one of the guys who played on the album, Nick Cody, actually who was involved with the show for that album, he had invited me to this party, and I showed up to the party. And when I got there, they were actually, I walked into the house, and they were actually listening to the album Club Unknown, and people were like dancing and having a good time, and it was like my music that was being pumped throughout the house, and it was a trip. It was wicked cool. It was a cool experience, but and it wasn't until years and years later, probably like 7 years, right about when I started Quantum, when I started writing music, I started to really love being in the studio, and now recording and being in the studio in general, especially when it comes to working on my own stuff, I love it. I love the challenge of it. It's super hard. It's a lot of work, but I've just learned that the more I can be prepared for that situation, the better and the easier it becomes. But tremendous, tremendous, knowledge has been gained by doing that, and also all the experiences I had around recording when I was younger, as hard as they were, and I still feel like the process is really hard. It's made the process a lot easier, and now it's like when I record, especially around Quantum albums, I love every second of being in the studio. I love every facet of it. I love writing. I love rehearsing for the upcoming project, and being in the studio mixing. I love the whole process of the production side. I mean everything, and I almost love it as much as, like, say, the live format or the live setting. In some ways, I almost like it more because you can just plug away and create these things from nothing, create these tunes, and try to and then with the live setting, you can't really go back and change it if something goes wrong. But with the studio stuff, you can always just have another pass of it or punch in. So it's a super fun process now. Again, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of it's this ongoing thing of where it's this ongoing journey of discovery, and and you're kind of pushed to your max, your ability, and it's incredibly hard and challenging, but it's also incredibly fun and just exciting. And I find too now when it happens, the more I plug away at doing those kinds of things in that kind of setting, it spurs more. It creates more inspiration. So I'll have more ideas in that setting to come up with something else or to add some new ideas. But it's a wonderful process, and so it's evolved to where now I love I love recording. The last recording sessions I did with the last two Quantum albums that we did. We recorded two albums at the same time, and that was in January of this year. We have a new album out that came out in June, and then another album that we recorded at the same time that at some point we'll be putting out. And I did a few other recordings since then, or be, really before that last year. Those haven't been released yet. So about three recordings I did the last year, three albums. One that's been out for since June, the last Quantum album, and but two of them are not not out yet. So probably at some point they will be. Definitely the Quantum album, and so, but super fun. So this brings me to this topic of today, and this topic of why I'm doing a show this early in the morning. Um, it's this guy here, Hagazussa. It's a German movie. When I was in Bull Moose the other day, it was actually, I think it was the last time I was in Bull Moose. Um, I saw this on the rack, and it was really cheap. It looked like this really interesting kind of foreign horror film that just looked wild. Never seen it, never heard of it, didn't know anything about it, and I love the artwork. Had this real like kind of pagan aesthetic behind it, and it's a German movie, Hagusa, and it came out actually 2017, and the basic premise of this movie, although it doesn't really, I mean, it does it justice, but it doesn't really, in a lot of ways. It's basically it's set in the 15th century, and young goat herder woman who is living alone in this mountainous region encounters this dark presence in the woods, and it plays with the idea of her family is basically possibly possibly has been put under this like curse of this kind of ancient pagan cult that dwells within this forest. And when I picked this up, I got this on Blu-ray, and unfortunately, it doesn't have special features. Well, it does. I mean, there's two or three commentary tracks, and I was hoping that there was more, but I'm definitely going to check out the commentary tracks. I do like commentary tracks. Some of them can be really interesting, but generally, there's a lot of commentary tracks. Usually, that's like a standard thing that comes with Blu-rays or DVDs. And a lot of the times I don't check those out. Sometimes I do. There's a few movies that I have where I have listened to them and they are really interesting. But generally, I'm a more of a fan of if there's like a documentary or documentaries about the film. Cool interviews with the director, those kinds of things. So unfortunately, this doesn't have any of that stuff on it. But there are like a few commentary tracks, which I definitely want to check out because this movie was a trip. One of the things that it says on here was that it was compared to in this review of Robert Eggers' The Witch that came out around 2017, kind of when this film came out. And The Witch is I'm a big fan of that film. And this is a German film, and it was directed by Lucas Fiegelfield, or Fiegfield. Lucas Fiegelfield. It's a German film, and it was distributed by Netflix, which is interesting. And this actually came out 2 years ago, but it was put out by Netflix about in 2017, so it's been out for a little while. And it's funny because I never heard about this movie, never saw it. So I started watching this a few nights ago. But it's a little under 2 hours, and I started watching the film a little bit probably on the later side of night. I usually tend to watch movies in the somewhat early part of the night. Um, and I remember putting this in, and I kept thinking, okay, it said in a review that it was very much like The Witch, which I really love, the Robert Eggers movie. It's the first film of his. So I started watching it, and I kept thinking of that movie, and I'm like, you know what? This is kind of really similar to The Witch, and almost to the point of where I felt like, is it kind of ripping it off, or is it too much of where it's trying to ride the curtails of that movie? Because The Witch is a pretty phenomenal movie. It was a big movie for Robert Eggers. It was the movie that put him on the map, you know. And since then, he's made The Lighthouse, and recently The Northman, which is a great, you know, just they're all. I think he's one of the best directors around. So is you know, it's a great thing to compare it to a new movie to that style. But he's definitely he's a pretty innovative guy. I think he's very original. He really has this thing of where Robert Eggers directs a movie, it's very meticulous and very focused on. If it's a period piece, he'll dive so hard into the concept of that and all that that entails. So I thought, okay, that's a cool thing that it's being compared to that. But my first reaction to this film, and again, it was, I don't know, it was like maybe a combination of things, was I felt maybe it is uh, too much like The Witch. You know, it was like trying to ride the success because The Witch was a very successful movie, and I thought maybe it's a little bit of a ripoff of that, which can be cool, but then it can also be, you know, an easy way out because I feel like The Witch was very much its own thing and very original. But that being said, it's a great movie to be compared to. But I couldn't, I don't know, I started watching it too late. I couldn't really get into it. I thought it was interesting. I thought the cinematography was really cool. It was really slow, but there were things about it that I was like, I don't know, maybe it's too much like The Witch, and I can't get that out of my head. That's all I think about. So I stopped watching it, and then the other night, last night, I was like, okay, I'm gonna just go into this movie cold and try not to think about anything else but how this movie can be or could be. So I just threw it in, and I really, really, really enjoyed this movie. My reaction was completely different. It's an incredibly slow movie. The pace of it, it's a typical trait sometimes of European cinema films, you know, European horror films or what have you. The pacing can be really really slow, which I'm a huge fan of. You know, I mean, obviously if things are too slow, they can be boring, but I typically like things that are on the slow burn side of where there's like, you know, you're getting this information, but it's really, really slow, and there's this build up, and you're getting this information, and hopefully, if it's done well, you're being pulled in slowly, you know, by minute. And this movie is incredibly slow. The cinematography for this movie is simply breathtaking, like gorgeous. It all takes place in the mountains, like during this like period of the 17th century, somewhere in Europe. You kind of feel like it might be somewhere in possibly Germany or Sweden. It's gorgeous. It's amazing. It takes place in these deep dark in this deep dark forest on the in the mountains, and like I said, it's an incredibly slow paced movie, but it's really, and the music is just incredible, and it's truly a haunting film. And there are certain sequences in this movie. It's really my first reaction of like, and again, I don't think it's a ripoff of The Witch. I think it the similarities I would say that it has to The Witch is that it's very very slow, and it's a very it's very spooky and subtle at times, but it has this really cool aesthetic similar to what The Witch has, where it's very slow. There's a lot of these great single shots of the woods and certain things in nature. To me, really, that's where the comparison kind of ends, because where this film goes, about an hour or so into the film, there were definitely some moments where I was just like, WTF? Like, it suddenly the film takes on this thing of where you feel like you're in this acid trip. I mean, it's super trippy, and this totally hallucinatory experience, and it's very very ambiguous and incredibly strange and mysterious. And there's a lot of times where one of the things I will say about it, and again, these aren't criticisms, but one of the things I could say about it, if you're comparing it to The Witch, for instance, like The Witch, you kind of know, even though I really love that movie, and it's not a criticism really of that movie, but The Witch, you kind of know to a degree of what the film is going to be about when you set off to watch it or you start watching it the first 5 or 10 minutes. You kind of know where the story is going to go. You kind of get what's going to happen. There's a level of where it's kind of predictable. And one of the which works, I think in that film it works because it's a very powerful experience. And the atmosphere is so incredible. That being said, one of the criticisms I've heard of The Witch, particularly with a couple of friends that I have that are really into horror films and like all kinds of different styles of filmmaking. Also, they're very open minded. But one of the criticisms I had heard from people that I'm friends with was that they felt the conclusion to The Witch was um, too predictable and a little bit too by the numbers and a little bit of it was too cliche for a film to kind of end that way. And I can understand that argument. Like it does. Like I said, like you watch a film like The Witch, and you kind of know what's going to happen to a degree. You know what the setup is. Obviously, centered. If you've seen that movie, it's centered around this girl who is part of this family that's been kind of banished, and they're living in the woods, totally isolated, and these strange things happen one by one. And its story is kind of centered on the daughter. But the gist of it, you kind of understand, or you can kind of see where it's going to go. And then the ending is kind of like a continuation of that, obviously, or conclusive, this conclusive journey that this woman goes on, this girl. So you can kind of understand, you know, 25 minutes or so into it, you can kind of predict where it's going to go to a degree. This movie, on the other hand, where it's not at all there's no comparison. Like I said, the only comparison I can really say for um, Hagazussa and The Witch is that it's very slow. It's a slow burn movie, and it has this incredibly creepy atmosphere. And there are goats. There are scenes with some goats. That's really it, because she's a farm woman who basically lives on the island, and she lives in the mountains, and she is raising these goats, and that's like her source of income, and she uses their milk to make money and to go to these and to do these trades with other farmers and so forth. That's really, for me, is the only comparison, because this movie has a level of where like 20 minutes, or it's just about 2 hours, and 45 minutes into this film, I was I had no idea where this film was going to go. It got more and more ambiguous and more strange and more surreal, and it was like this. Like I said, I feel like it was like taking acid. It's super trippy. It's a super trippy movie. The cinematography is just amazing. The music is incredible. The atmosphere is amazing. There is not a whole lot of dialogue. It's just got these amazing images throughout the film. And again, it's got some scenes in this film that are just completely shocking. Um, where there's a couple of scenes in the film where I felt like the people involved with making this film took some chances, like not a commercial film. And for it to be, I think it's commendable that Netflix got behind this, because this movie is not a commercial film really by any means. It's because there's some scenes in it that are truly disturbing. Um, there's scenes of where, without giving it away, but there are scenes involving the movie where a character basically in the film basically drowns her own baby, and then there's a scene of where there is a scene of cannibalism in the film that is incredibly disturbing. And there's also a scene that involves, to a degree, bestiality in the film. And and there's like three sequences in particular in the film that were kind of shocking. Two in particular, I was just like, holy mackerel, like, wow. And it's, but at the same time, beautifully done. I think the cinematography, the direction was pretty. It was stunning, and I was kind of blown away by it. And then the other thing too, like I said, it's about 2 hours, just shy of 2 hours. I had no idea where this film was going to go at times, and I liked that a lot because I was glued to this glued to the screen, and I at times I thought, okay, it's probably going to go in this direction, but then it would just go totally outside the box, and I really loved that, and it was really ambiguous. And then the ending for the film was completely ambiguous. Like it could be many different things. I felt like it was definitely conclusive, but it was not predictable, and it wasn't definitely wasn't a cliche movie. And it's like a classic kind of gothic horror film, um, but it has um, the other filmmaker or other style. There's a filmmaker who's Lars von Trier, who's a German filmmaker who's made a lot of like pretty experimental movies. He's probably most well known for The Antichrist with Willem Dafoe, which is a pretty brutal and harsh movie, but it's an amazing movie. But it's generally hard to Watch. He's made some pretty incredible films, and at times I would say it reminded me of some of his work, uh, because of the areas of where the story will move into, and it generally moves into areas involving the characters that or situations that are generally disturbing, like really disturbing, and generally at times kind of hard to watch, and they make you uncomfortable. And Lars von Trier has those aspects in some of his films, especially like the film like The Antichrist, which is an amazing movie, but there's some scenes in it where you kind of almost have to look away. So it kind of reminded me a little bit of that at times, mixed in with like the art house kind of European kind of thing, and like a real traditional gothic horror film. It's definitely a horror film, but it's very mysterious. It feels like the whole film, especially the last hour, you're in this dream, and it's very surreal. You're not really sure what's coming at you or where the story is going, but yet you're just totally intrigued. So Hagazussa, yeah, one of my favorite new discoveries, and I can't, I kind of want to watch it again because very very slow, but I feel like you're getting all this information throughout the whole process of the film, and the way the story kind of develops. And it's an interesting juxtaposition because it's very very slow, but I feel like there's so many different kind of layers, and there's so many different things going on at the same time that watching this film, I think this would be one of those films, if you see it multiple times, you'll get something different out of it, or you'll see or hear a new thing that will give you some other interesting clues or things that you might have missed from your initial reaction from the film. So I'm very much looking forward to watching this again. Um, and the Blu-ray, like the only thing that's disappointing, it doesn't really come with special features, but it was so worth it. Got this for a really good price at Blue Moose. Um, and the color, the transfer of this on Blu-ray is just magic. It's gorgeous, and the soundtrack is just like incredible. The film score, so it's totally worth it. Totally worth buying. I was super excited. So this is Jason Dean, Film Fanatic. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe to the page, and definitely check out this wild movie. This is a one of the better ones I've seen in a while. Have a great day, and we will see you next time. Peace.